The 4th century before Christ, the canopic mouth of the Nile, where the great river finally spends itself into the Mediterranean. It is the busiest doorway in the ancient world. Every ship that wants to trade with Egypt, every Greek merchant, every cargo of silver and wine and oil, must pass through one city first. They moor along its stone quays in the shadow of a temple to a god the Egyptians call Amun-Gareb. Priests collect the taxes. Customs officials stamp the manifests. This is the gateway to the richest kingdom on earth, and its name is known across the Mediterranean. The Greeks call it Heracleion. The Egyptians call it Thonis. And then it is gone. Not abandoned, not sacked, not slowly forgotten and left to crumble in the sun like other dead cities. Gone beneath the water. By the 8th century after Christ, the great port had vanished entirely under the waves of the bay, and for more than 1,000 years, no one could find it. Scholars began to wonder whether it had ever truly existed, or whether it was just a name that a few ancient writers had passed down. Half history, half legend. For centuries, a story clung to it, that the city had sunk into the sea in a single terrible day, swallowed whole like a smaller, real-world Atlantis. It is a beautiful story, and the strange thing, the thing that should unsettle you, is that when archaeologists finally found the city lying on the seabed exactly where the old texts said it should be, parts of that impossible story turned out to be true. To understand how a great city drowns, we first have to go down and find it. The search began not with a shovel, but with a magnetometer. In the year 2000, a French underwater archaeologist named Frank Gaudio was working in Aboukir Bay, a shallow stretch of the Mediterranean a little east of Alexandria. Gaudio was not a treasure hunter. He worked methodically in cooperation with the Egyptian authorities, dragging sensitive instruments across the seabed, sonar that read the shape of the bottom, and a magnetometer that could feel the faint magnetic signatures of stone and metal buried under the silt. The bay was murky. Visibility was poor. Whatever lay down there had been hidden for more than 1,000 years beneath layers of Nile mud. For a long time, no one had been certain the city was even real. Thonis and Heracleion appeared in a handful of ancient texts, in Herodotus, in a few inscriptions, but no ruins had ever been found on land. Some historians had come to suspect they were two different places. Others wondered if they were any real place at all, a name without a city. Then the instruments began to draw a map. Out of the noise of the seabed, patterns emerged. The long, straight lines of harbor walls, the dense clutter of a settlement, the unmistakable mass of something enormous lying broken on the bottom. Gaudio's team began to dive, and in the gloom, divers' hands closed on the edge of a colossal statue of red granite, a figure that, when finally raised to the surface, stood more than 5 meters tall. The city that the textbooks had nearly erased was not a legend. It was lying on the floor of the bay, almost exactly where the old writers had said it would be. After more than 1,000 years beneath the sea, Thonis Heracleion had been found. What the divers found, as the surveys widened, was not a single ruin, but an entire drowned world. This was the great port of Egypt, and it predates the city that replaced it. Before Alexander the Great founded Alexandria in 331 before Christ, Thonis Heracleion was the obligatory gateway into Egypt for every ship arriving from the Greek world. It had likely been founded centuries earlier, perhaps around the 8th century before Christ, and through the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries it flourished as a center of trade and worship. To enter Egypt by sea, you came here first. On the seabed, the shape of that city is still legible. There are the harbor basins where ships once tied up. There are the foundations of houses and the stubs of quays. There is a great temple, the temple of Amun-Gareb, the chief god of the city, the deity Egyptians believed could grant a new pharaoh the powers of kingship. Canals threaded through the settlement. A network of waterways and smaller islands knit the whole port together, so that parts of it moved as much by boat as on foot. And everywhere, the divers found the things that drowned with it. Colossal statues of red granite, more than 5 meters tall. a god, a pharaoh, a queen. Smaller statues of gods and sphinxes, bronze and stone images of deities, gold coins and rings and jewelry, hundreds of anchors, stone tablets carved in Greek and in Egyptian hieroglyphs, everyday pottery from across the Mediterranean. It was a port frozen at the moment the sea took it, its temples and its market and its ships all settling together into the same dark silt. Gaudio has estimated that even after years of work, only a small fraction of the city has been uncovered. The rest is still down there, waiting. But here is the detail that doesn't fit. Here is the part that brings us back to that old impossible story. A whole city does not simply walk into the sea. Coastlines change slowly. The sea rises by millimeters a year. A delta sinks gently under its own weight over centuries. By every ordinary measure, the drowning of Thonis Heracleion should have been a slow retreat. The waterline creeping up street by street, generation by generation, until the last inhabitants quietly moved to higher ground. That is how land is usually lost to the sea. Patiently, almost imperceptibly. And much of it did happen that way. But not all of it. Because when geologists examined the sediment beneath the sunken city, they found something stranger written into the ground itself. The clays and sands under parts of Thonis Heracleion bear the unmistakable marks of liquefaction, the signature of soil that, in a single violent moment, stopped behaving like solid ground and began to behave like liquid. When that happens, anything resting on top of it has nothing left to stand on. Buildings don't topple. They sink, straight down all at once, swallowed by ground that has briefly turned to fluid beneath them. The old legend said the city went under in a single day. The science says something almost as strange, that at least part of Thonis Heracleion may have dropped several meters into the seabed, not over centuries but in moments. Whole districts collapsing into liquefied earth, as if the ground had simply opened and pulled them down. The myth wasn't true, but it wasn't entirely wrong either. So how do you drown a city? To answer that, you have to weigh several forces that worked on Thonis Heracleion together over a very long time. Start with the ground it was built on. The Nile Delta is not bedrock. It is silt. Thousands of years of mud carried down by the river and dropped at its mouth. That sediment is heavy and it is soft, and under its own immense weight it slowly compacts and sinks. Geologists call this subsidence. The whole northern edge of the delta has been gently settling for millennia, and the city sank with it, a little at a time, century after century. Now add the sea. Since the end of the last ice age, global sea levels have been climbing, and ancient writers themselves noticed the Mediterranean creeping higher along this coast. So the land was going down while the water was coming up, a slow vice closing from both sides. By around the 2nd century before Christ, parts of the city were already being lost. By the 8th century after Christ, it was effectively gone. But subsidence and rising seas are patient. They explain the slow drowning. They do not, on their own, explain the sudden collapses written into the soil. For that, most researchers point to shock, earthquakes, and the tidal waves that can follow them. The eastern Mediterranean is seismically restless. A strong enough tremor striking that waterlogged delta clay is exactly the kind of trigger that sets off liquefaction. So the honest picture is not one cause, but a conspiracy of them. Slow subsidence and rising seas drowned the city over centuries. And earthquakes, tsunamis, and sudden liquefaction finished districts of it in an afternoon. The legend of the single day and the science of the slow centuries are, in the end, describing the same death from two different distances. But the sea, in drowning this city, also preserved it. And out of that preservation came the single most remarkable thing Thonis Heracleion has given us. First, it settled an old argument about its own name. In the temple, divers recovered a great stone slab, a stele inscribed with a royal decree, commissioned by the pharaoh Nectanebo I in the 4th century before Christ. The text was nearly identical to a known stele from the city of Naucratis, but with one crucial difference. This one named the place where it stood, and the name carved into the stone was Thonis Heracleion. One stone confirmed that the Egyptian Thonis and the Greek Heracleion were not two cities at all. They were one city with two names, exactly as a handful of scholars had long suspected, but had never been able to prove. And then there are the ships. Across the harbor floor, archaeologists have mapped the remains of more than 70 ancient vessels. One of the largest collections of ancient ships ever found in one place, deliberately scuttled or sunk over the centuries the port was in use. Among them was one that rewrote a footnote in history. 24 centuries ago, the Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt and described a peculiar kind of Nile cargo boat called a barus. Built in a way unlike any Greek ship, its hull assembled from short planks pinned together like courses of brick. For generations, scholars doubted him. No such vessel had ever been found, and Herodotus had a reputation for tall tales. Then, in the silt of Thonis Heracleion, the team uncovered a wreck, and it was a barus, built exactly as he had described, plank by plank. 2,400 years after he wrote it down, the drowned city handed back the proof that the old historian had been telling the truth all along. And yet, for all of this, most of the city is still unknown. By Gaudio's own estimate, after more than 2 decades of work, only a small fraction of Thonis Heracleion has been surveyed and recovered. The great majority of it still lies under the silt of Aboukir Bay, unmapped and untouched. Temples, houses, ships, and statues that no diver has yet reached. So the hardest questions remain open. We still cannot say precisely how the drowning unfolded, how much of the city sank slowly, district by district, over the long centuries, and how much of it dropped suddenly into liquefied ground in single catastrophic events. We do not know which earthquake struck, or exactly when, or how many. We do not know how many people were living there at the end, or whether they had time to flee, or whether some of them went down with the streets they stood on. The sediment records that something violent happened. It does not tell us the day, or the hour, or the human cost. There is something humbling in that. We tend to think of a lost city as a puzzle that, once found, is solved. But Thonis Heracleion was found a quarter of a century ago, and it has spent that quarter century deepening the mystery rather than closing it. Every season of diving pulls up another statue, another inscription, another wreck, and every one of them raises as many questions as it answers. The city is no longer lost. It is simply still being read, one stone at a time, in the dark beneath the sea. The legend said a great city sank into the sea in a single day. The truth is slower and stranger, and somehow more unsettling. A city drowned by the patient sea and the sinking earth over 1,000 years, and torn down in moments where the ground itself turned to water. We still cannot say exactly how it died. Some cities don't want to be found, and even when we find them, they don't give up everything they know. Buried worlds. Next time, not a city that sank, but a city that hid. Carved straight down into the rock beneath Turkey, level upon level into the dark, deep enough to shelter 20,000 people from the world above. Derinkuyu, the underground city carved deep beneath Turkey, and the 20,000 people who vanished into the rock.